Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to Maximum Downforce, episode 19 of the 2021 Formula One World Championship. I am your host, Will Knight, and joining me for the first time, Alex Bomberg, and once again, Harry Parkhouse and Merisse Baker. Guys, the São Paulo Grand Prix, quite similar to the Mexico City Grand Prix. Not sure why they changed the name, obviously for tourism purposes and such, but I think we can all say it was the Brazilian Grand Prix, realistically. It was a fantastic race. Drama, intrigue, controversy, and ultimately, good racing. Alex, how would you rank this race compared to the rest of the season so far?
Yeah, I think it's certainly up there. There was a lot going on. Very telling for the last couple of races of the championship as well. Mercedes seemingly finding some form. Different to last time, they were quick in qualifying. This time they were quick in qualifying and the race. Lewis on a completely different level to everyone else out there, and certainly showing everyone that this championship is well and truly not over.
Now, Harry, heading into the race weekend, we all knew it would be the final sprint weekend of the season, the third one before next year it becomes a full-time thing, 6 of them coming at us for 2022. Heading into the race, what were your expectations of sprint, given the first 2 attempts were relatively a mixed bag?
Yeah, they were. I think that when you come into a circuit like Brazil, you expect overtakes, you expect good, close racing, and I think that the sprint delivered that as such. Obviously, as Lewis was coming through the pack from the back, a lot of people were saying that the drivers weren't probably defending as hard as they would have in the race, but whether that was the case or whether Lewis was just in the more dominant car. But either way, from him having the disqualification from qualifying and starting at the back made the sprint a lot more exciting than I think if Lewis would have started on pole would have. So that did add another element into it. But you look back at the other races we had, Italy, and of course around Silverstone, they were, yes, obviously you have the new intriguing dynamic of the sprint race, but as a race as a whole, I don't think there was too much drama. There was obviously a couple of offs for Gasly and Perez in the races respectively, but other than that, it wasn't too much involved with it. And I think it's going to be really telling, as we've said before, if this sprint race format is to continue with the cars and the overtaking. Is something that we want to see. We want to see more overtakes on the track. We want to see side-by-side racing. We want to see close battles for not only the lead and for pole position for the next day, but all throughout the pack as well. And going around a track like Brazil, yes, it did offer some interesting dynamics and interesting battles, but if they are to get further with this sprint sort of qualifying format, I think the cars are going to be a major benefit for that. And going into next year with the massive regulation changes, that could certainly be a defining point on whether they keep this format or whether they've been it for the years after to come. So as a whole, I was looking forward to it again, the sprint, because it is, like I said, providing a different outlook on the weekend and provides obviously more viewers on the Saturday. But as a whole, I don't think you can say it was a negative impact on the race weekend this time out. I think that in Italy and Britain, it was somewhat of a mystery as to what was going to happen, and not much did change. So it was certainly interesting to watch, and I think that if that sort of level of sprint races to continue for the future, then it is certainly an element that they will implement in the future more often.
Now, Merisse, we'll start with you on the opening headline of the weekend. 3 minutes into FP1, Mercedes confirmed that Lewis Hamilton would take a 5-place grid penalty, just 5 at this point, after an engine change. In conclusion to that, personally, I believed that 5-place grid penalty, combined with the fact that Sao Paulo, a relatively high altitude circuit, I honestly thought that Red Bull would have this race under wraps. Were you and people that you know, were you under the same influence and the same opinion? Or did you have the hope that if Hamilton could perform in qualifying, he'd be able to overcome the 5-place grid penalty at that time?
Yeah, I think because of what we saw in Mexico, and obviously that's another high altitude circuit, I think because we saw how fast, especially Max was, but both of the Red Bulls were, I think everyone headed to Brazil with the opinion that, yes, Red Bull will most likely be the quicker car there, and obviously we were all surprised that I think Mercedes were very fast. But I do think that Mercedes taking the penalty there was a tactical thing to do, because the rest of the the circuits they have are sort of unknown. So Jeddah and Qatar are unknowns, and then Abu Dhabi is not known for overtaking. So I think this is probably the prime opportunity to take that penalty. And even if they did think that Red Bull would have been much faster than them, the last few years we've had at Brazil have been chaotic races. And, you have no idea what could happen. Lewis, you've got all that opportunity at the start of the race, incidents, things like that. So I wouldn't say that Mercedes went into it thinking, oh, we're going to, not do as well because we think Red Bull are faster. You don't know until you turn up. And obviously it did go in their favour. And also because of the sprint race, I think it obviously gave them a taster of how quick they were. And obviously that solidified that taking that grid penalty was the best thing to do. But overall, it is a good track for overtaking. So it was probably the prime place for them to take that penalty.
Alex, after qualifying, Lewis Hamilton had taken pole position, Max Verstappen was second, and a few hours into the evening, there started a bit of a thing on Twitter with quite a few journalists sort of sitting around on Twitter, having a bit of a laugh, tweeting at each other. But it was such a serious situation in the fact that Lewis Hamilton was under investigation for a DRS failure of some sort, because the teams test their DRS, an 85 millimeter circle, and with 10, I think it's 10 newtons of force, they try and push this through the rear wing slots. If it goes straight through or passes through, it fails the test. Now, the W12 failed the test of Lewis Hamilton, and ultimately that got him sent to the stewards. Just before we actually get into the fact that he received a disqualification, what were your opinions after this announcement? Did you think anything of it, or did you think it would just be another one of those things which would just be thrown under the rug very quickly and nothing would come of it?
I was very surprised to see it happen, and initially I thought it was quite a serious thing because I saw the document that was sent to the stewards, and that was tweeted on Twitter, and I saw that, and obviously that was serious at that point. And at that point, I'd really thought Mercedes have dropped the ball on a track where they're quicker, should be theoretically after qualifying outscoring Red Bull. And I thought at that point, as I said, it was very serious. I was expecting Hamilton to be disqualified, which he eventually was, and I thought that was his weekend and potentially championship over, because you put anyone else in that situation. We've seen Bottas before struggled to come back through the pack after receiving penalties. I thought Hamilton would be the same, but obviously we've all seen the race, and that wasn't the case at all. But certainly, I think a mistake, or a big mistake on Mercedes' side, and thankfully Hamilton has sort of dug them out the mud slightly there, and he's definitely pulled himself back into this championship fight.
Harry, on the other side of the championship fight as well, Max Verstappen was given a €50,000 fine for breaking Parc Fermé rules by touching both his own rear wing as well as the rear wing of Lewis Hamilton. This sparked quite a debate because previously in the past, and this is why I'm asking you, Sebastian Vettel, I know you like to follow Vettel's season very closely. Vettel is known for being an investigator, often moving the cars. I think it was in Russia one year he almost kicked the tyres to try and wheel the car around and have a look at the condition of either Hamilton or Bottas's tyres. Now, quite a lot of people didn't really understand that the reason that Verstappen was given this fine is because the part under investigation was also under investigation in the Hamilton disqualification. So essentially what Verstappen had done is, and quite a lot of people thought that Verstappen may have actually jeopardized this disqualification because it could have been an example of Mercedes using that to back up why the wing was broken, but it never really came to that.
It's all quite tied in ridiculously, in my opinion. I think that the moment Verstappen gets a fine, it's from the rear wing, and then now Red Bull are now looking into Mercedes' rear wing and the drag in which they're getting off of the straights. And of course, the DRS, I think it was 0.2 millimeters. I think that it couldn't fit through the stop gap. That's the reason why Hamilton was disqualified in the first place. So it was very fine margins, and what it has gone down to is it was just purely unlucky for Mercedes, and it was just a technical fault with the back of their car. As they said before they went out on qualifying, it was fine, and afterwards it wasn't. that was obviously going at the high speeds, in which the engine and the new engine obviously probably might have had an impact on as well, would have caused some sort of problem and DRS fault, and therefore the stock car couldn't fit through, or fit through way too big. So that 0.2 millimeters was crucial in the end, even though it is such a small margin. But the fine for Verstappen, people were saying that Verstappen could have tampered something with it, which is absolutely ridiculous with the amount of force that Verstappen must have had on that Mercedes to be able to create that such of a gap between the DRS wings opening. It's ridiculous, the sort of state that Verstappen had anything to do with it. And obviously you mentioned Seb Vettel, and which Inspector Seb, as he gets called quite a lot on Twitter, I see running around. But he, as you said before, he was wheeling sort of tyres. He was looking more about tyres and barge boards and the floors of the car, not necessarily too much of the DRS and the rear wing. And as you said, that was the bit that was under investigation. So it all uniquely ties into each other, and it all is getting very political and complicated. And I think that, I'm not sure whether we'll touch on it as well, but before the race, obviously, Mercedes were very unhappy after they were disqualified for rear wing infringements, and then Red Bull were allowed to change parts on their rear wing just before the race and from qualifying. So it was, Mercedes were angry, and rightly so, because yes, it was a fault on their own behalf, but Red Bull were getting off a lot lighter than Mercedes were within the race. And I'm pretty sure Toto Wolff was mainly frustrated at the fact that this is the third race in a row in which Red Bull have changed and made changes from Parc Fermé to the rear wing of their car to adjust it for the race, which, yes, if given permission, which Red Bull were, is allowed. But Mercedes are right to sort of be a little bit intrigued into what Red Bull are doing, and like so Red Bull into Mercedes, because we saw the pace in which the Merc has on the straight. We saw it earlier on in the season with the Mercedes engine just in the McLaren. We saw how quickly the McLaren was flying down the straights, and now it's sort of gone into the hands of the actual factory team in the Mercedes. So it's certainly an interesting dynamic, and one that is going to rumble on for the rest of the season. And we've heard that Horner has said that Red Bull aren't going to yet make an inquiry to the stewards about their rear wing, but you feel that if it goes down to sort of Saudi Arabia, which is a track that, by the looks of things, is going to have very high speed corners, a lot of high speed or sort of medium speed corners as well, and only one real hairpin section, that it's going to ridiculously suit this Mercedes if it has that significant speed advantage which showed at Brazil. So if it gets down to that sort of stage in the season and the Mercedes continues this dominance, then I think Red Bull are going to have a look into something, because it is sort of becoming quite political between these two, not only teams, but between principals as well.
Merisse, Harry just mentioned that Red Bull are looking at this rear wing and the drag on the straights being almost dropped. And Christian Horner, as we reported at Downforce Radio on the other night, he says that we won't be protesting at this race. Do you think Red Bull genuinely believe that Mercedes are doing something illegal with their rear wing, as it was the other way round in France and Azerbaijan and Spain and Monaco, those races earlier this season? Could there actually be some form of protest made in Qatar? And do you feel any like anything will come out of this?
Well, I do think Red Bull, I think they probably won't want to look into it immediately. I think it'll be a case of getting down to the last few races, and if Red Bull really think they're behind, I think they'll push the investigation. I don't think they're really worried about it unless they think Mercedes are going to beat them. And obviously that's Christian Horner's mentality. I think if it was any other team, he wouldn't care, because on the face of it, it's like, oh, he cares about fairness in the sport. Obviously they want everybody to adhere to the rules, but if it was any other team than Mercedes, we know that he probably wouldn't look into it. Even if he found some evidence, you have no idea whether he'd pursue that and try and get them penalised. But because it's Mercedes, obviously he's going to want any advantage over them. I'm not entirely sure if they would investigate it, and to be honest, up until this point, those cars are scrutinized and checked every single weekend multiple times. And I feel like if they did put that to the FIA now, I don't think anything would come of it, just because of how many checks those cars have gone through so far this season. Just how we saw at the start of last season, Das was found out quite quickly and that was gone over. But obviously, I do feel now that with everything that they go through on the cars now, I don't think there could be anything. And if it is consistent that Mercedes are faster at these specific tracks that have these characteristics, it would make sense. Or, you know, if Mercedes have found a loophole to make them faster, that's all part of the game in a way. But I don't know if anything would come of it, because if it did, it would cause a lot of controversy and it would be very difficult, I think, in a way for Red Bull to then take that title. But obviously Horner's going to look for any opportunity, as would Toto, to, you know, win the championship, and they want all the cars to be fair. And he obviously has a right to look into it if he thinks it's not right. And maybe this weekend suggested to him that he did want to look into it because of that rear wing discrepancy. But I did see something actually touching on your guys' points from earlier, that because obviously we saw that a lot of the teams got stuck in Miami with all their parts, that the FIA may have rushed the scrutineering on some of the cars and therefore may not have picked up the Mercedes rear wing discrepancy. Not sure if that's true or not, but obviously, you know, they have a right to look into it and the rear wing, but both teams are going to be pushing to the maximum every single weekend, and stuff like that with Lewis's rear wing will just happen if it, you know, by accident, things like that happen. But I feel like it would only be down to maybe the last two races if Red Bull do decide to look into it.
Yeah, this is a sport governed by politics at the end of the day, and understand, Merisse, what you mean about Christian Horner coming out. He wouldn't protest this if it was another team, but at the end of the day, if it was a team like Haas who were doing this, he wouldn't need to do it. But realistically, teams are going to take any chance to take an advantage, and ultimately, I do believe that Red Bull thought they would have the advantage, Alex, when Lewis Hamilton was disqualified from qualifying and was forced to start from the back of the grid in sprint. Now, I came out before the race, or before the sprint race, I said that to you, actually. I didn't think Hamilton was going to get above the top 12, because I thought that for a start, I thought he would be starting from the pit lane, given it was a Parc Fermé breach, and traditionally that would mean starting from the pit lane. Ultimately, however, he clawed his way back up to 5th place in just 24 laps. Now, I think that is possibly one of the best drives I've seen in quite a while.
Yeah, no doubt. I completely agree. I remember talking to you before the sprint race, as you mentioned, and I said if he gets in the top 10 in just 24 laps, that's an achievement. But to go into the top 5 is, you know, as you said, I think it's up there. I think Hamilton said himself, it's certainly up there with one of his best weekends in Formula One. And I don't know where he found that pace. I know, obviously, I heard some things when he was passing the likes of Lando Norris, Charles Leclerc, and those sort of drivers later on in the sprint race. They probably weren't fighting it as much because they knew they'd get back ahead of him anyway because of Hamilton's 5-place grid penalty. But no doubt that doesn't take away from the drive to go from, you know, dead last on the grid up to 5th in the space of 24 laps. That's a great achievement, and as you said, one of his finer drives. Certainly in recent memory, but potentially in his whole career.
Certainly, drives like this and Germany 2018 especially just sort of landmark why this man is a 7-time Formula One world champion. Ultimately, Harry, though, I think it's time to give a bit of love to Valtteri Bottas. He didn't really get much love over the weekend. He claimed pole position on the soft tyres, managing to outmaneuver Max Verstappen at the first corner and then just go into the lead and avoid Verstappen's charge right at the end. It was quite an impressive weekend in terms of the fact that he's up against Max Verstappen and Lewis Hamilton. It's not going to be an easy ride. He claimed pole position, took 3 points for Mercedes, outscoring Red Bull in the sprint by a single point. And that point, given the closeness of this championship, could be crucial to another Constructors' Championship.
Yeah, Mercedes have extended their advantage after losing a lot in Mexico. And Valtteri Bottas, obviously famously the most F1 sprint races in history of the sport. So an absolute legend of the sprint race scene is Valtteri Bottas. So I think that in terms of pace-wise compared to Lewis, you looked at this the weekend, and we saw even in the first practice session that Lewis might not have been 100% confident actually at the start of it before he got the penalty. But then once it got into the qualifying session, we saw this sort of different animal, and Bottas couldn't necessarily catch at all, no matter what. You know, he's got ridiculous engines as Valtteri Bottas, the amount of engines that he's had, but you've never really seen a bigger gap, a bigger significance from an engine boost than Hamilton had. And I don't think that Bottas could keep up at all. And he did mention throughout the race, especially when him and Lewis both pitted, he said that Mercedes threw away an easy 1-2, which was an interesting comment to make, because on one hand, you can look at it and say that, yeah, Bottas is trying to help his team still. He's trying to help his team in the constructors. Obviously, he's got nothing really to fight for other than P3 in the Drivers' Championship with Perez, which is actually quite a big fight, but all goes down to whether cars, I guess, at the moment, and the last 3 tracks. So I think that as a general consensus on Bottas this weekend, it was a decent weekend for him. Obviously, you've got to credit his performance in the sprint. He didn't start on pole. He managed to make the move on Max. Yes, Max was catching in the latter laps, but Bottas held on well, and you've got to credit that for him. And I think that as an overall, since really the announcement in which we knew was coming that he was moving to Alfa Romeo and George is taking his place, Bottas has stepped up his game a little bit. I think that he's not necessarily got that pressure that he's fighting for the seat anymore, even though he might have known it a couple of weeks maybe beforehand. But I think that the pressure in which he had being at a top team like Mercedes, not just a top team, the best team, going for constant Constructors' Championship, yes, he's delivered and done his part as a number 2 driver, but I think at this point now he needs to solidify himself within the sport, and being at this top side in Mercedes isn't necessarily the best thing for him at the moment. I think he needs to go to Alfa Romeo and sort of rejuvenate his career a bit. I know he is at the latter stages of his career, but a performance like he's shown at Brazil, if he consistently shows that next year in Alfa Romeo, he's going to be just fine against whoever his teammate is. Maybe Guan Yu Zhou, as it has been leaked over the past week. But I think Valtteri did put on a decent performance this weekend, and compared to Max, who he was catching in the later laps, I think he might have been able to catch him. The strategy that he called potentially might not have worked, might have worked, but that's if buts and maybes. So I think you can say, as a general consensus, Bottas will be quite happy with the weekend. He beat Perez, who was his main rival, and was closing in on Verstappen, nowhere near the pace of Hamilton, but it was a solid performance, pretty mid-tier, but a decent one for Bottas this weekend.
This is where we get to the good bit, everyone. The possibly the biggest controversy of the weekend, other than the disqualification, Max Verstappen and Lewis Hamilton. On lap 48, the two were going side by side into turn 4 down the Reta Aposta. And Max Verstappen on the inside, Lewis Hamilton trying to overtake on the outside. We haven't seen the onboard yet, or at least I haven't seen the onboard yet. Max Verstappen and Lewis Hamilton both go off track, different opinions. Me personally, I think Max opened up his steering a bit, and ultimately I think he was quite lucky to escape without a penalty, as Martin Brundle agreed with me in his coverage of it. Merisse, I'm going to give you the honour of starting this topic. I'm going to ask all three of you. Max Verstappen, should he have got a penalty for the lap 48 incident?
Yeah, I'm not a fan of talking about Hamilton and Verstappen incidents because I am quite a Hamilton fangirl. So I try and look at it without bias, which is quite difficult for me. But yeah, I think the fact we didn't see an onboard of his steering wheel and, the ways he was turning means that there's no clear-cut judgment we can make because there's not as much evidence as we'd like. But from what we saw, it did look like he ran him off track. Obviously, you can see the two noses and see who's ahead. It was pretty much equal. But obviously, Verstappen's going to do anything he can to keep Hamilton behind. And I don't really blame him for doing that because I think he'd sort of rather suffer the consequences and try and keep Lewis behind and do everything he can. Because he probably knows that could be the championship right there. Every single point counts now. So I do agree with you. Not just on my Lewis bias, but I do believe that Max pushed him off. But I just in desperation, I think he was, just a bit aggressive, and he was so, determined to keep that position that he wanted to stay ahead of him. And the fact that they both went off track sort of suggested that Max didn't attempt to make the corner himself, because it wasn't like Lewis prohibited Max from making the corner himself. Max sort of just decided to not make the corner, and therefore he went off as well as Hamilton. I think if it was just Hamilton who'd gone off, it may have been a bit more 50-50, but because both of them went off, it suggested that Max made no effort to turn in. So I think that was a bit bad from him, but the fact that Lewis was able to pass in the end means that I think not a lot of people will take notice of this, but if it had finished Max then Lewis, there would be a lot of unhappy people and an unhappy Toto, I think, because it should have probably been something that was looked into. And even after that, we saw again Max swerving and got the black and white flags after that. So he was doing even more to sort of keep Hamilton behind, and he knew that Hamilton was going to get past eventually, and obviously wanted to make it difficult. But yeah, I think it's just that stage of the season where the desperation's kicking in. He knows that everything is on the line, every point counts. But I do agree with you. I do think they should have at least investigated it a bit more.
Alex, you're involved in quite a few karting championships. Do you feel like if you were to force another driver off the circuit and then follow them off the track, forcing both of you off of the black and white stuff, the tarmac, do you think you get a penalty for it?
Yeah, for sure. It's pretty black and white. If you force another driver off the track, it's a penalty, full stop, and it's fairly similar rules. And I'm in agreement with Merisse. I think initially I thought it was very borderline, but it wasn't a penalty. But having reflected on the incident, having watched it again, obviously not the onboard because that is seemingly being hid from everyone. But having reflected, I think for sure it was a penalty because I don't think Max made much of an attempt to stay on the track himself. And if I'm honest, how they didn't make contact throughout the 3 or 4 laps of battling, I don't know. But thankfully they didn't, and Lewis did make that move. But yeah, I think it would be a penalty, and I'm surprised it wasn't a penalty. I think Mercedes have reason to be annoyed that it wasn't a penalty, because had they've given, say, a 5-second penalty for that, which I think a lot of us would be in agreement that it would be fair, Verstappen would have dropped behind Bottas. So it could have been a Mercedes 1-2 had the stewards looked into that and ultimately given a penalty. But ultimately Hamilton ended up making the move on Verstappen, I think two laps later, and ended up getting the win. But yeah, I think it was very, very borderline for Verstappen. And I think, as Martin Brundle said, Max was a very lucky boy not to get a penalty.
Harry, in the past, most recently the races in Austria, I think it was Lando Norris was handed a 5-second time penalty for forcing Sergio Perez off of the circuit. Do you think that the São Paulo Grand Prix almost highlighted the need for more consistency from the FIA? Because in the past, this has resulted in a penalty because there's been gravel on the outside of the circuit. Do you feel that because it's a different material and the drivers can just keep on going, that makes it acceptable?
It's an interesting point. I haven't necessarily thought of it like that. And you brought up Austria, and I think it was 2 separate incidents that awarded 5-second time penalties. It was Norris Perez, and I think Perez had it again with Charles Leclerc afterwards, after it being done to him. So I think that the gravel does play into it a lot, because if one of those drivers were to go further off into the gravel, it would have certainly ended in disaster. I think that Merisse made a brilliant point in the fact that both the drivers went off the track. So if there were gravel at Brazil there, that would have ended in tears for both of them, whether it would have been damage to their car or they would have seen both out of the race. And we know in sprint races, these two like to collide in the race after. So I was very surprised, to be honest, to see that Verstappen got away with it. Not only that, but I think that Max was, throughout this entire weekend, he knew Hamilton had the pace advantage. So he was trying all he could to keep him behind, as he knew that was the only way he was going to win the race with track position. As Horner said, I believe, live on Sky, the only way they were going to win this race was through track position and not through undercutting and overtaking, because they just simply didn't have the pace. So if you look back at the incidents you said before, Will, with the 5-second penalties, if there were gravel there, and to say Verstappen did force Hamilton off of the track there, I think it might have made a bit of a difference. If Hamilton was to go off into some sort of gravel trap or something else, or just onto some grass, it would have been interesting, because that would have been completely far off of the track in which they did go. Verstappen, the line that he took, if he took that line as just a regular race, if Hamilton was not there and he took that line, his lap time would have been invalidated. He went so far off the track. It's a very interesting one to see how and what the steward said to Mercedes afterwards as well, as to why it wasn't given a penalty, because Verstappen left Hamilton absolutely nowhere to go. There was nowhere that he could possibly have put a wheel on the track when they were side by side at that point. And I think that also Alex made a brilliant point in the fact that if the right decision, as everyone said so far, if that was a 5-second time penalty, which I believe it was as well, then he would have dropped behind Bottas. As Alex said, and that is crucial for not only the driver's standings to gain more positions or more points on Max for Hamilton, but for the constructors as well. That would have been huge for a 1-2. So it's all if buts and maybes at this point, but I think Max is lucky, and if he defends like that, or if he races like that further on in the season, these last few races, it's going to end in tears. And I think personally, Hamilton, it won't affect him as much. Now he's come through Verstappen and he won the race with such ease after that. It won't affect him as much, but Max will certainly be confidence stricken from this. I know he's been playing it cool and calm and saying that P2 was the best he could have done today, which in effect probably was at Hamilton's pace. But I think Max will be very disappointed that he couldn't hold on from Lewis today. And I think that if this pace advantage lasts, Max has got a worry on his hands, and this championship is far from over yet.
One man we've largely ignored so far, Sergio Perez, Max Verstappen's teammate. He qualified after the disqualification. He took third, got jumped by Carlos Sainz in the sprint, so he started fourth. And into second, it was a Red Bull 1-2 in the opening stages, until obviously he was passed by Hamilton. Ultimately, I feel his race was curtailed by a virtual safety car brought out by debris on the circuit, which allowed Valtteri Bottas to pit a bit later than everyone else and have a quicker pit stop. I feel it was a bit unfortunate for Perez. Do you think he could have challenged for the podium without that virtual safety car?
Yeah, I do think he did. Before any of them had pitted, when we saw Hamilton overtake Perez, we did see Bottas getting very close, because obviously he was also in the slipstream of both of those two cars and had DRS when they were battling ahead of him. And he seemed to drop off from Perez quite a bit after that battle, whether it was, really hot tyres or anything like that. But considering Hamilton's pace, you would have expected Bottas to at least be able to pass Perez, and he didn't seem like he was able to at that stage of the race. So I think the virtual safety car helped him a lot, because I'm not entirely sure he would have been able to get back past Perez after, because even in the first stint he didn't seem to have the pace, even though he was 7-8 tenths behind Perez for a few laps. He then dropped off to be 2-3 seconds behind and never regained it. So it helped Bottas a lot, and I'm not sure he would have had the pace on Perez. At the end, we did see him start to gain a lot on Verstappen, and that's because we obviously saw Verstappen's tyres go off dramatically. And obviously Hamilton was extremely fast, so I wonder whether the Red Bulls may have not had as much pace at the end, and Bottas may have been able to get Perez at the end, suggesting what we saw by the times at the end of the race. But I think those two are very closely matched in terms of second drivers this year, especially with all the progress I think that Perez has made. And also it would have been interesting to see where that fastest lap point had gone had the virtual safety car not come into effect, because those two most likely would have been battling for the rest of the Grand Prix, and Hamilton could have still had that fastest lap, or somebody else could have taken it. But I think it would have been very, very close between the two of them, and we probably would have seen the Max and Lewis battle, but with those two drivers as well.
And before we leave the championship fight, this is the first time we're going to do this on this show. There's 3 races remaining, 14 points between the championship leaders. Max Verstappen currently leads the World Championship. Alex, if we start with you, and then we'll go to Harry, and then we'll end on Merisse. I want to hear your thoughts on who will win the championship. Will Hamilton claim his 8th, or will Verstappen claim not only his first World Championship, but also the first World Championship for the Netherlands? Just give me your thoughts.
I think if you would have asked me before the sprint race on Saturday, I would have said it's Verstappen's championship to lose. And I still believe it almost is Verstappen's championship to lose. He's certainly in, no pun intended, the driver's seat. You know, as you mentioned, 14 points clear at the top. It's a healthy buffer to have with 3 races to go. However, Verstappen and Red Bull have to be concerned with the pace that Mercedes have shown in the Brazil race. Although it's not as much of a Red Bull track as Mexico has been traditionally, I think they certainly showed a very, very good and concerning, from Red Bull's side of view, concerning turn of pace. And if they can keep that up, certainly Lewis can claw back that gap and overturn it coming into the final round in Abu Dhabi. So I think right now it's too close to call. If I had to put my money on one person, it's very tight, but I'd go with Max just because of the season he's had, and I do believe he can get it done, but I think it will go down to the absolute wire.
Yeah, I think Alex sort of summed up how tight this will be towards the end. I think if you would have said before Mexico, I would have gone Max. After Mexico, Max. And now after Brazil, I'm really leaning towards Hamilton. As much as I am in favour of Verstappen winning this championship, getting his first, and obviously if Lewis doesn't win, it will be record breaking. But I can't see, if this Mercedes has this power advantage over this Red Bull, I cannot see how Hamilton gets stopped. He's not going to get stopped by his teammate. The only man in his way is Verstappen. Perez isn't going to come that close to him. So the only man that could possibly stop him is his championship rival. So any team orders at this moment is out of question. I think that you look at the Mexico pace, though, as well. If you look back at that, then you'd say that Red Bull have a significant advantage. So whether it's just swinging one way and another is interesting, and especially with what Merisse said earlier, 2 very much unknown tracks coming up in Qatar and Saudi Arabia. So, well, it's really tough to call, but I think I'm going to go, surprisingly, for Lewis Hamilton to turn it around and get at least 2 out of 3 wins in the next 3 races and win it for an 8th world title.
And Merisse?
Yeah, it is incredibly difficult to choose between them, and honestly, it is really good because it means we've had such an exciting season. You guys have completely summed it up in that Brazil has proved that Hamilton's still hungry for the championship, is essentially what's happened, because he was knocked back however many times with all the penalties and everything, and he still came back to win. And I think people started to doubt if he was as hungry as Verstappen was for this title, but I think this race proved that he is, and maybe it's going to give him the momentum to get those wins. But obviously it's not going to have stopped Verstappen. We know he does well under pressure, obviously the same as Hamilton. So I think it's completely dependent on these tracks we've got coming up. We predicted that we think Mercedes will be faster at the next 2, and then Abu Dhabi is sort of an unknown, because the last time we were there, obviously Max took the win, but maybe Mercedes had their foot off the gas at that race because they'd already wrapped up both championships. So honestly, I have no idea who's going to win at all. Obviously Hamilton has all of the experience, and after this weekend, I think I am going to go with Hamilton just because of the types of tracks we've got coming up, and that they may favour Mercedes, and if he can take advantage of that, then I think he can win the world title. But we know that Max is going to fight incredibly hard to win it as well. So it'll be very, very tight.
I think you've all given perfectly good reasons there on reasons either driver could win the title. I think the way I would sum it up is it's absolutely horrid and painful and tense to not know who's going to win this World Championship. I think that's absolutely amazing. And that's going to be the question to everyone listening today is who do you think will win the 2021 Formula One World Championship? Now we can finally start moving down the rest of the grid, take a look at the different stories in the midfield and the back of the pack. And starting it is the fight for third. We've talked about the fight for first and the next best championship battle, possibly even the third best championship battle now, Alex, because Ferrari really did pull a margin out ahead of McLaren today. And ultimately, to quote Majet Camara last week, I think McLaren are in trouble.
Yeah, for sure. I agree. I think the gap that they have, I don't know the points gap exactly, but it's a healthy lead for Ferrari. And McLaren would have to have an amazing final 3 rounds to turn it around because Ferrari look, without a doubt, best of the rest as you would behind Mercedes and Red Bull. And McLaren just haven't been able to challenge in the last few races. At Brazil this weekend, only managing to score 1 point with Lando, Ricciardo eventually having to retire as a result of an engine issue. It was looking all right for Ricciardo. I think he would have been around the seventh place spot, but either way, they still would have lost a heap of points to the Ferraris finishing 5th and 6th. And as you said, Will, McLaren's certainly in trouble. And I think we'll all be in agreement that it looks like they're going to be ending up 4th this season. Nevertheless, let's not forget, just a few seasons ago, they were languishing down in 8th and 9th in the championship. So to come from there in 2018 all the way back up to at least fighting for third and, of course, finishing third in the Constructors last year, it's certainly a good achievement, but they certainly had their eyes set on third. And I don't think this year is going to be the year for McLaren to make it 2 from 2 in terms of getting third place in the Constructors' Championship.
On the other side of that championship fight, McLaren had a very, very poor day at the office. Obviously, Lando Norris opened the Grand Prix with a puncture after contact with one of the Ferraris, Carlos Sainz, off of the line. And that practically, in my opinion, ended his race from the first minute of the Grand Prix. But he managed to claw a point, which, considering the context of the race, isn't a bad job.
No, overall, I think that McLaren will be very, very disappointed this weekend. As you brushed on about the Norris incident lap 1, it had to be a Ferrari that he collided with. It simply had to be. It was almost set in the stars that it was going to be a McLaren versus Ferrari sort of shootout that went wrong. And in the end, you can't say that it was anywhere near Sainz's fault. Unfortunately, Norris thought he got past him and swerved a bit across the left, almost reminiscent of Charles and Seb last time he went to Sao Paulo. So, yeah, it's very unfortunate for McLaren. I think realistically, the only reason why in which Norris got that point anyway is because I know you said we're not going to mention him, Will, but Seb Vettel's still coming into this podcast no matter what you like. It was a poor Aston Martin decision in which led Sebastian Vettel to only just being behind Lando Norris in the end. So I think that Norris did get lucky to get back into the points, but whether he would have finished up off the Ferraris anyway is a different question because I think the Ferraris had a very lonely race and a very good pace set throughout the entire race. So I think that I don't think McLaren can necessarily keep up with Ferrari at this point. I think that the gap that Ferrari have managed to get and the fact they've got such consistent teammates who are fighting for themselves, really, they're not exactly ones in a league of their own, like sort of last year with Charles far ahead of Seb. But I think that Carlos has come in and really rejuvenated Ferrari at the moment, and he's rejuvenated Charles as well. They look to have a brilliant partnership, brilliant friendship together, and I think that Ferrari have a very strong lineup for a couple of years to come. And with that extra bonus money for third place, they could certainly kick on next year. We know how powerful their engine is and how much they've been working on this 2022 car. So it could really be a defining year for Ferrari next year. But on the other half, as you said before, McLaren, it really was a shocking weekend for them, scoring just a single point. It's not what you need when you're in a battle for third in the Constructors' Championship. And whether this is sort of an omen to say, right, there's only 3 races left, we probably won't have the pace to beat the Ferraris. Let's just focus on next year. We could see it happen, who knows. But I think that ever since, really, we saw the 1-2 in Italy, it's sort of been a downward spiral. for McLaren, and Ferrari have only really benefited from McLaren winning in their home. So certainly Ferrari on top, and I can't really see McLaren getting back at them in the constructors really to the end of the season.
On the other side of the McLaren garage, Merisse, Daniel Ricciardo retired from the Grand Prix with a cracked chassis. I don't want to say it was a return to his previous form for Daniel Ricciardo, because ultimately he performed well for a substantial part of the weekend, but I feel it was almost a return to his previous luck, in the fact that it's another mechanical failure in Daniel Ricciardo's career which has prevented him from scoring points.
Yeah, I think it's very unfortunate for him, especially in a time where, he's getting used to the car and he wants to have all those laps in all the time, and he wants to prove to the team, yeah, I am here to score points for you and help you get this third place. But obviously it is very difficult when things like that happen, and especially when both of the Ferrari drivers are up there, getting really good points for their team, and even in the sprint race as well, Carlos getting that point. So it is a big shame for Ricciardo, because as the amazing driver we know he is, he deserves better than that, but it can happen to anybody. And just how Lando got the puncture at the start, he had that bad luck, and he managed to get back and get a point at the end of the day. So I think it's unfortunate, but there's sort of nothing he can do about it. Obviously it's a bit worrying that it's the Mercedes engine, and Mercedes may have to inquire into that. But if we are saying that the next few tracks are advantageous for Mercedes, perhaps it might help that McLaren also have that engine in their car. But it's really bad luck for Daniel, and we did see him have a good run of results, but McLaren just haven't had the pace the last few weekends compared to Ferrari at all.
And now we can just take a breather for a minute from the 2021 season. Going back in history, my favourite segment of the podcast. Alex, I'm not sure if you'd be familiar with this bit, but this is On This Day, where we take a look at different moments from Formula One's past. Now, we are recording this on the 15th of November, and that does indeed coincide with the Australian Grand Prix of 1987. That championship was won by Nelson Piquet in his final year with Williams. My question to you three is, what team did Piquet move to in the following season, 1988? Alex, if you kick it off, and then we'll go to Harry, and then we'll go to Merisse.
You've put me completely on the spot there, Will. Really testing my knowledge, but I don't know. I'll have to pass this one, unfortunately.
I actually know it, so I don't know if Maris wants to go first.
Yeah, I mean, as usual, I have no ideas at all. I have limited knowledge up until about 2000, and then it's all like foggy, mainly because I wasn't born, so I have like no concept of what specific drivers' teams were. I'm just gonna guess. I don't know what teams were around that time. Benetton, maybe.
Harry, would you like to enlighten us?
Well, I think he already had the title wrapped up by the Australian Grand Prix, so he moves from his title-winning Williams to Lotus, I think.
He did indeed move to Lotus. That was a very good guess, Harry. And ultimately, you are the winner of today's
Whoa, not a guess.
Yeah, you've managed to do it. You've won this On This Day segment. Fortunately, still unable to challenge Topher, because Topher's been well and truly on it this year, but nonetheless, a bit of a consolation prize there.
We take it.
Anyway, moving back from the little bit of fun there to Formula 1 2021. Alpine versus Alfa Tauri, as we start to get into the teams, beginning with the letter A. Well, I think Alpine and Alfa Tauri, the championship fight for 5th, continuing to get a little bit spicy here. Harry, they finished equal once again in the championship standings, both scoring 112 points so far this year. Alpine leading AlphaTauri on countback with that win in Hungary. It's certainly starting to get closer and closer as the season goes on, and ultimately, like every other title fight this year, I genuinely can't see who will come out on top.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, actually, because in terms of the car balance, I would probably say that AlphaTauri is a much better car at the moment than the Alpine, as we see Gasly consistently performing at the higher ends of qualifying and in the race. But as you know very well, in the constructors, it's not just a one-man game. Unfortunately, for AlphaTauri, they need two drivers in this championship, and with Alpine, they've got it with Ocon and Alonso, two consistent drivers. Ocon with a race win, and Fernando Alonso is just Fernando Alonso. We know he's going to be consistent and always fighting as hard as he can, in no matter what machinery he's in. So, going on to, I don't know if we're going to mention him later down in the podcast, but Yuki Tsunoda didn't necessarily have a very good race today. Unfortunately, he started to pick up a bit of form recently since sort of about the America time. So it's certainly one that's hard to call, but I think that the main thing that at the moment these two need to look at is qualifying pace, because the Alpines have not showed it anywhere near as good as Pierre Gasly has this season. So if Gasly can keep sort of this form going, I see no reason as to why AlphaTauri can't come out on top, especially if Tsunoda can chip in with a couple of P9s, P8s as well during the last three races. I don't see why AlphaTauri can be beaten by Alpine, because I do believe they have a superior car at this point in time. And it's no Red Bull, but it's still not too far off, I don't think, the sister car. And I think that if Pierre Gasly keeps up this form, and obviously if he doesn't run into any reliability issues or any problems during the start of the races, I think AlphaTauri are going to have it for me.
Alex, I don't know if you'd agree with me here, but I'm starting to feel that Yuki Tsunoda is perhaps one of the most frustrating drivers in Formula One, because it's practically as soon as you feel he's starting to get on it and starting to show what a talent he is that we've seen in his Formula 2 days in the US, and ultimately defending from Lewis Hamilton in Turkey for a substantial amount of the race. His last few performances, ultimately Mexico wasn't his fault. Clattering into the side of Lance Stroll's Aston Martin, it's not a good image, especially in this fight for fifth that we're talking about.
No, I'd completely agree. I almost liken it to his sister team, ex-driver Alex Albon, who, moments we saw in 2019 and 2020 where we thought, okay, maybe he is starting to get a little bit more comfortable, and then the next race he'd throw it away, put it in a barrier, run into the side of someone. I think we all remember Alex's radio from the Nürburgring back last year saying, they raced me so hard, when he's simply trying to pass Pierre Gasly in an AlphaTauri. So I can almost liken it to that, and I think Yuki is struggling, and he certainly hasn't had the effect on the sport in his debut season as some of us certainly thought, especially after Bahrain, when he managed to claw back into the points after starting near the back. So he's certainly struggled, and I feel as if he could be AlphaTauri's downfall in the fight for fifth. Nevertheless, I think Pierre Gasly, on the other hand, is certainly one of mine, and I think a lot of other people's up there with best driver of the season. He's had a fantastic season, as last year. He's been really on it for, nearly all the season. I can't really point out a race where he's underperformed or really struggled. And he's really been the driving force for AlphaTauri to get to that fifth position. And I do believe through Pierre's hands in that car, he will be able to drag it and keep it above the Alpines, of which they are at the minute, because I think it was mentioned earlier, Alpine struggling a little bit to get into the bottom end of the points, obviously managing to get both cars in the points this weekend at Brazil. But I do think Gasly's just got that little bit of extra pace that will drag AlphaTauri just ahead of them across the finish line for fifth in the Constructors.
Paris, looking at other teams down the grid, it's not something to do with the Grand Prix, but something which leaked on Twitter a few days ago. I think it was on Friday, actually. Alfa Romeo Racing are one of the only teams, in fact, the only team to not have confirmed their driver lineup. Someone posted on Twitter a few days ago an image of an Alfa Romeo dealership in China, which had Guan Yu Zhou placed on the windows, congratulating him for becoming China's first ever Formula One driver. I think it's practically nailed on now, the fact that Giovinazzi is going to lose his drive. The team they were expected to be making some form of announcement today or tomorrow. Obviously, most likely now it will be the latter. Giovinazzi hasn't had the longest nor greatest Formula One career. Who would you choose if you were to sign a driver? Would you keep on Giovinazzi almost as practically a stopgap before Théo Pourchaire possibly comes in for 2023? Or would you take a risk with Guan Yu Zhou, especially the fact that he's reportedly bringing $30 million to the team?
Yeah, I do think Guan Yu Zhou is a good option. You know, he's had those couple of years in Formula 2 now. He's got a good foundation there, and I think it is good to have a rookie on that team because obviously they've got Bottas coming down, so they'll have that experience there, just as they've had with Kimi the last few years. They'll have Bottas there to help the younger driver, and I think Guan Yu Zhou would be a good fit for that seat because he's proved that, you know, he's a race winner in Formula 2, he's determined to do it, and I think, you know, drivers like Théo Pourchaire probably need a few more years in Formula 2. We've obviously seen that Tsunoda only did the 1 year and he's not had the best of seasons this year, so perhaps it suggests that they do need to let these drivers have a couple years in the lower categories before they move up. So right now the best bet is looking towards somebody like Guan Yu Zhou. Obviously the money side of it is a big selling point, I guess, for them to take him on, but also that he is a good driver, and I think it'll be an amazing opportunity for them to have a Chinese driver on the grid and, you know, to see his potential, because I wish there were loads more teams so that all these rookies, you know, like Callum Ilott who missed out on a seat and all these other drivers we wish were there, and we want them all to move up, but there's just not enough seats, so it would be great to see one of those drivers move up. And yeah, Guan Yu Zhou seems like the prime candidate to do it for now, and a good choice, I think.
Before we round off the show, I just want to take one final look at Sprint. There's been 3 trials this year before 6 are introduced next season. I just want your 3's opinions on the format. And all in all, we know it's confirmed it's coming back next year, but do you think it should be brought back next year, Alex?
I think there's certainly grounds that it needs to be improved upon, because the point that I've said throughout the season, if you picture a scenario, you're in 6th place fighting for 5th. Is there much point in making a move, albeit, you know, potentially risky, just to get that one extra grid position for, you know, the race on the next day? Because realistically, if you're quicker than the car ahead, you're going to get them in the main race the day after, and that's where the points are handed out. So I feel as if the problem with the sprint is that there's not enough reason for a driver to make up one move with the risk, because if it goes wrong and they make contact, they're going to start at the back of the grid. And if you're looking at, say, you know, a McLaren, an Alfa Tauri, and Alpine, if they start at the back, they're not going to be able to produce that Lewis Hamilton sort of drive where they can drive through and get into the really significant points. So I feel as if some of the drivers are a bit more cautious on that side, which does sort of put a bit of a dampen on the racing in the sprint. So I think the concept of it is good. We've seen it can work in championships such as Formula 2, but I think the ins and outs of it need a little bit more working. I think the top 10, maybe the top 8 should score points. Obviously a lessened point system than the 25, 18, 15 and so on we see in full races, but maybe a 10, 8, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 sort of system could work out and give the drivers a bit more motivation, a bit more reason in sort of the upper midfield to make their moves, rather than just waiting until the day after and just sitting behind for the sprint, because, you know, there's no points up for grabs, and if they're quicker they can get the next day. But I think the concept of it is good, but there should be a little bit of refining of the rules to really make it, you know, a really good attraction for the fans, rather than just what it has been, sometimes 24 cars or 20 cars, sorry, lapping around for you know, 100 kilometers race distance. I think there needs to be a bit more jeopardy involved, and a real reason to go for that move.
Harry, the 3 races which have followed the sprint format qualifying, they've all been some of the best races this season. Is that just a coincidence, or is it maybe to do with the unpredictability of the sprint? Does it set the scene for chaotic and great racing?
I think it does have somewhat of a link. Yeah, I think you can say the fact that in Britain, Perez had that problem in the sprint race, didn't he? So he was coming through the pack. Gasly had it in Italy. He was coming through the pack, and I guess it gave sort of the drivers more of a motivation to fight for their place where they are. As in, when they qualify, they're not going to want to lose 4 places off of their grid spot instantly just because of a poor start. They're going to want to make up from that. So, in that sense, I guess you can say that the racing afterwards has had a slight effect because of the sprint race, yeah. But in terms of, say, if Verstappen and Hamilton would have had one of their collisions on one of the sprint race days, both of them were out, both of them were back on the grid, that would make an incredible race, would it not? I think not only would the sprint race be brilliant, but also the race afterwards would be great. So in that sort of aspect, it adds more risk than just a regular qualifying session. Obviously, there are offs in a qualifying session, as we see usually just once, probably throughout throughout a Q1 session during the race weekend. So, yeah, there are incidents, but a sprint race provides more sort of drama, I guess, than a qualifying session. And whilst having a qualifying session too, it is certainly a decent concept in which they've come up with. But I'm in complete agreement with Alex, to be honest. In fact, there needs to be more incentive for these drivers. Yes, of course, they're going to want grid position, like I mentioned earlier, but are they really going to fight for P6 and P7, like Alex said, if they're not being awarded anything? In reality, if you're in a Ferrari or a McLaren who've got a significant pace advantage over the cars behind them, like an Alpine or an Aston Martin, they're not going to want to be fighting them in the sprint race if it's for absolutely nothing, are they? They're just going to either defend or not defend and just let them prove they've got a pace advantage, which they usually probably don't. But I guess the incentive-wise, there needs to be more points added in. It would create sort of tighter sprint races. So, and I guess you can say on one hand, this weekend, the sprint race did sort of help Hamilton out, because if he would have had no sprint race and it just went off based off of disqualification and qualifying, he would have started last in the race instead of where he started in 10th, and it would have been a significantly harder job to get to the front of the grid at the time he did. So, yes, it helped Hamilton out, but there's a say for him in the future, maybe it would help Verstappen out or a rival with Hamilton. So there's certainly tweaks that need to be improved on for the fans and for the drivers and for the teams. But as of a whole, I'm not too opposed for it coming back for 6 races, especially with new cars next season.
Harris, possible fixes for sprint, things that can be changed, altered, possibly removed. Is there any particular point you would highlight?
Well, I completely agree, with the other two about giving them an incentive and maybe putting points there. I think they need to make sure they do it at tracks. If it's going to be 6 tracks, it needs to be somewhere where overtaking is easier. Not easier in a way that they take them flat out down the straight and it's just DRS, but in a way that they can fight properly, because there's no point implementing a sprint race on a track such as France or somewhere that we know, or Russia, where we know there's not a lot of overtaking opportunity. I think reverse grids would be a good idea, because we saw how amazing it was to watch Hamilton come through. And if we think back to the other two, where it was just sort of, I think in Silverstone, it was Max leading Hamilton around after the start, and that was sort of it, and there may have been a few battles down the field, but it wasn't as interesting. I think the main event on the Sunday sort of overshadowed it, and we forgot that it wasn't as great as it could have been. So I think possibly reversing maybe like the top 8 or top 10 would be a great idea to make that racing good, because then we've got fast cars behind slower cars. But obviously the likes of Mercedes and Red Bull may not like that, and I wouldn't be surprised if Toto and Christian say, no, we don't want to do that. But at the end of the day, if we say points are awarded up to something like 5th, it wouldn't be that much of a disadvantage to, if you qualify first, start 10th. That's not a big gap for teams like Mercedes and Red Bull to get back up into the sort of points positions. and it would mix it up, even if it is for 5 or 6 races, something like that could help. But obviously it's a case of getting all the teams on board and not jeopardising the championship in a way that it's sort of altered and fabricated and made it so that the wrong teams win, if that makes sense. Not in terms of Red Bull winning over Mercedes, but it's unfair and it's sort of fabricated so that it's not competed in a fair way. So I think there's things that can be done. This year, it was a complete trial. We've seen Brazil obviously was amazing, but I think if Hamilton had started first, like he was supposed to before the disqualification, it wouldn't have been as great. So something needs to change where we see cars fighting, and the only real way we're going to get that is if they do some sort of reverse, I think, or obviously looking ahead to 2022, regulations, that's going to be completely different. So for now, they could probably leave it as it is and see what it's like in 2022 with all these new cars. And if they get all the overtaking they want, and if all the things they say about these new cars is true, the sprint races could be amazing, could lead to amazing races on, for the Sunday as well. If it doesn't work and it's sort of the same as this year where we don't get a lot of action, then they can probably look into it.
Well, there we go. Thank you very much. I'm afraid that is all we have time for. Thank you very much, Alex, Harry, and Merisse, for joining me for another episode of Maximum Downforce. And of course, thank you very much to all of you who are listening at home. Remember to go and check out the Downforce Radio socials at Downforce Radio on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, you name it. We're on it, as well as the Downforce Radio website, downforceradio.uk, to check out the latest and greatest news articles from the world of motorsport, as well as our radio station. Thank you very much for listening. Hope you have a wonderful afternoon, evening, morning, wherever you're listening. Goodbye.
Go, go, go! Anytime and immediately! This is amazing! The worst